Here, give me a chance to get a few mouthfuls of lunch down the hatch before we get rolling here again. The second portion of the threat modeling discussion is going to be presented by Mike Howard, and we will go from Mike's talk into a discussion of some futures, and then from that into sort of a more blue sky session on threat modeling in general and what it's possible futures might be capable of. So with that, I'll go ahead and let Mike take it from here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. What I want to talk about now is still threat modeling. Something that Frank sort of alluded to is there are some. Actually, no. Let me back it. Let me start with a bit of history. So, about 2 or 3 years ago, David LeBlanc and I, actually it goes even further back than that, almost 4 years ago, there was a bunch of us in Windows who were thinking about threats. We were thinking about the threats to the systems, the threats to our software, not in terms of implementation bugs, implementation vulnerabilities, or issues in the code, but rather just what are the threats to the systems. The fact that you put a box on the internet means that there are certain actions that you can expect to see targeting that machine. Potentially looking for vulnerabilities, areas of weakness, design flaws and such. And this is literally about 4 years ago. And we came up with this thing called Stride, which was a way of categorizing threats. Think of Stride as just a slightly more fine-grained version of CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That's really all Stride is. So it's spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and finally elevation of privilege. So we were pretty happy with that. It sort of helped get us thinking about, so what are the threats to the systems? How can you spoof this? How can you tamper with this? What defenses do we have to help mitigate tampering threats and so on? Then, 18 months or so later, David LeBlanc and I wrote the first edition of Writing Secure Code, and we documented a lot of this in a chapter in that book on design, as opposed to just coding. And at that point, we thought that Stride was threat modeling. And we're happy to report that we were dead wrong. Stride is absolutely not threat modeling. And in fact, when we taught people just pure Stride, and we looked at their results and their threat models, they were pretty atrocious. They were very inconsistent. A lot of them were pinpointing just pure vulnerabilities. If we have a buffer overrun here, then we have a problem. So we'll don't have a buffer overrun there. Fix the code. This bug means that there is a cross-site scripting issue over here. Therefore, we have a threat of attack. You have a vulnerability in the code that needs to be fixed. So we found that it actually wasn't very prescriptive, and some threat models were actually pretty lousy, actually. They turned out to be just extensions of the bug hunting database. So then we started doing a bit more thinking about it, and we were talking to the SQL Server guys, and you've got to realize that SQL Server, these guys are all data guys. They want to understand data and data flows and data analysis and data schemas and such. And they said, well, why don't you think about where the data came from? You want to model the app. One of the big questions that we had was, well, how do we know a threat model covers the application? I mean, how do we know that we're actually covering the bounds of the system, as Frank said? And the SQL Server guys said, well, we use data flow diagrams a lot when we're documenting our stuff. Why don't you use DFDs or some other modeling language to model the application? And then at least you got a good starting point as to what the system really is, as opposed to just some stick figures on a whiteboard. And so, yeah, it sounds like a great idea. So we took that even further, and so we ended up with this notion of using DFDs to help with the threat modeling process. At this point, we also understood about threat trees and based from hardware fault trees, and we understood quite well how to build threat trees, and so we folded those into threat modeling analysis as well. We had this thing called DREAD, which is a way of sort of assigning appropriate risk to, and I'll explain DREAD shortly, to the overall threat, the risk of a threat occurring or an action occurring that can cause this particular circumstance to be something you didn't want. So we have this thing called DREAD, which is actually born out of the Microsoft Security Response Center. When an issue is given to us to the MSRC, we apply a DREAD rating to it, which is discoverability, repeatability, exploitability, affected users, and discoverability. And it's just a way of ranking overall risk, like just how nasty is this. So then there's a few other things that occurred where, so Frank Swiderski, who was the talker just prior to me, joined Microsoft. And he joined from At Stake. And they'd done a lot of threat modeling work. And now here was the freaky thing. It turned out that a lot of the work that we had done in terms of understanding the threat categories through Stride, they were also using that, but they were using CIA. We were using threat trees. They were using threat trees. We were using DFDs. They were using DFDs. But for very, very different purposes. It turned out we're using DFDs for completely different purposes. And so there is actually still, I've got to be honest with you, there's still a bit of tension, which I actually think is healthy. I think it's actually a healthy tension between Frank and I. He's wrong, but hey, that's just the way it is. But no, seriously, what we intend doing is a lot of very good benefits that Frank and Wendell Snyder have in the way they use DFDs, and there's benefits in the way we use DFDs. And one thing we want to do is try to come together with this sort of grand plan of threat models as we understand them today, rather than having two sort of disparate systems. And so what I want to do now is explain the model that we have in the Windows division. You've got to realize that Frank's work is born out of the developer division, but now he's in our group, which is technically part of Windows. And so we're now trying to bring these two together. And as I mentioned yesterday, Frank and Window are now working on a book for MS Press called Threat Modeling, which looks like it's going to be a very good book. We're actually very excited about it.
Does developer mean, what is the difference between Windows and developer?
The developer division, Visual Studio.net, .NET Framework, ASP.NET, and so on, as opposed to Windows. So anyway, the basic tenet behind threat analysis and threat modeling is when we looked at old issues and the way products were built, people thinking about, ooh, we need to eradicate this bug, let's build a test plan, let's make sure the bug doesn't exist. They're all very much very sort of implementation focused. And a lot of it was sort of post-process. In other words, ooh, a bug has been found, let's fix it, let's learn how to not make that same mistake, and let's build a test plan. And so it's very implementation focused as opposed to sort of design focused. And so the general belief of threat modeling, and I stand behind this, I truly believe this, is that you can't build secure products unless you understand your threats. You really can't. You can slap in any old security technology, SSL, TLS, IPsec, X.509 this, X.509 that, CMS, ACLs, permissions, privileges, firewalls, you name it. You may win the game of buzzword bingo, but still ship a pile of junk that gets whacked on day one with a buffer overrun because of some thing that you didn't mitigate or some threat that you didn't mitigate. And so the whole point of threat analysis is understanding how are people going to attempt to compromise me? How are they going? What attack vectors are they going to use, or avenues of attack are they going to use to try to get into my system to get it to do nasty things or things that I never anticipated? The other thing that we're very strong on, and this really talks to the buzzword bingo thing, is that just using security features doesn't mean you've got secure software. I talk about this. You can have all the technologies you want, but you can still have silly little mistakes, a la buffer overrun. One of the best ones I hear all the time is with secure using SSL. It's one of my favorites. I'm not going to name any names. I was about 3 years ago. I found myself looking at some code for a bank, and they had this notion of a back end, sort of a shopping cart, but for banking. Think of it as a shopping cart, but for banks. It was actually pretty cool. Well, one of the major threats was that someone could actually hijack that shopping cart. You could actually disclose the data in the shopping cart, the D in Stride. Or even worse, you could tamper with it. Sorry, I in stride, information disclosure. Or you could tamper with the shopping cart. So how do you get, this is an asset that requires protection. So how do you get to that asset to do nasty things? And so we talked a little bit about how do they identify what shopping cart the real user is using. And they were using good old cookies. Because HTTP being stateless, they had to have some form of sort of state management, and they were using cookies. So, well, how are you protecting another asset? Another asset is the cookie. How are you protecting the asset from being used or manipulated? And they said, well, we're using SSL. Well, that mitigates a certain threat. And that threat, actually two threats. And those threats are that someone can view the cookie as it goes across the wire, because SSL provides encryption. And it also helps mitigate, or mitigates tampering, which SSL provides through message authentication codes. But what happens if I can guess the cookie? So it turns out that if you did a request, let's say the cookie came back as 1001, did a request again but didn't send the cookie up, you got 1002. Did it again, 1003. Did it again, got 1005. All over SSL. It's like, well, that's interesting. Looks like someone logged on between my last two sessions. Force the cookie to 1004, make the request. You've now hijacked someone's shopping cart all over SSL. So the point I want to make there is that we investigate very heavily when someone says, well, we fixed this because we use this technology. And it's really important for people to understand what technologies really fix which problems and which do not. The other aspect of threat modeling and threat analysis in general is finding issues. These generally, threat modeling should be done at the design phase or sort of the requirements gathering phase. It should be done very early in the process or as early as possible. You can use threat modeling as a bug hunting exercise. And to be frank, during the Windows security push, threat models were used as a bug hunting exercise because Windows Server 2003 or Windows.NET Server, as it was at the time, was already in full flight of development. So it was really as a bug hunting exercise, which I would argue is not the optimal way of using threat modeling. So the whole point, however, is to do a threat analysis before you really are in full flight. And you find design issues ahead of time. And so you change the design before you actually start writing much of the code. But if you do use it as a bug hunting exercise, they find different flaws than code reviews and test plans. Code reviews and test plans tend to find implementation flaws. Buffer overrun there. Really lousy encryption technology, poor key management, implementation flaws, whereas threat models tend to find design flaws. And one thing we found, especially with some of the major groups, about 50% of their issues come from the threat models, which means that if people don't have threat models in place, there may be a whole bunch of design issues they don't even know about yet. So the threat modeling process that we have in Windows, like I say, Frank and I and Windows and so on, and actually quite a few other people are sort of beginning to come together on merging these two techniques. First of all, it's created a model of the application. Personally, I don't care what models you use, whether you want to use UML or DFD or back of a napkin. I mean, just as long as it's relatively accurate representation of the application. Now, this is where Frank and I differ, one of the areas where we differ. The point of the DFD from our standpoint is to understand the assets that require protection within the application. As a side effect or as a benefit of using the DFD is to understand where the data came from. And I'll explain why that's important very shortly. But in Frank's view of life, the DFD tells you where the data came from, and that's the most important thing, with the list of assets being less important. And the DFD is not used necessarily as identifying the assets. Then you look at these different assets that require protection, such as the web server, the shopping cart, the cookie information, the user's data on the machine, the back-end databases, the actual channel between the user and the web server, and the channel between the web server and the back-end database, and the web server and the LDAP directory that's used to perform some form of username lookup. So when you have this list of assets that require protection, you think, okay, this is a... So in the world of DFDs, you have processes, data stores, data flows, and interactors or external entities that interact with the system that are generally not necessarily under your direct control. So certain assets have certain kinds of threat types. So for example, you can't elevate privilege against a data store. There is no such thing as an elevation of privilege against a data store. You can't do it. But you can view the data in that data store, and you can tamper with it. You can change it. So certain assets that come out of a DFD or UML model have certain kinds of threat types. So what you can think of is, okay, so there's a data flow between A and B. Is that data flow susceptible to spoofing, tampering, repudiation, and so on? Well, it's definitely susceptible to tampering, definitely susceptible to information disclosure. You actually don't necessarily deny service directly to that data flow. You'll deny service to the process that is processing the data flow. And so this is what you start thinking about. And this requires a little bit of experience to come up with that list of threat types to the different aspects of the DFD. Then you build a threat tree. Okay, so there is a denial of service against this process. How do I pull? What conditions must exist for me to be able to pull that off and actually to become a real issue that could impact the system? And then finally, you rank threats, and that's totally based on risk. How people calculate that, we honestly don't really mind that much, just so long as people are consistent. One thing we ask product groups to stay away from as much as possible, if they're doing something like risk is the potential for attack, how easy it is to pull off, what's the potential for it actually occurring, versus multiplied by or some mathematical operator, the damage that will ensue if this threat becomes a reality. Some product groups for a while started factoring in there how much it costs to make the fix. Our view, and it's relatively staunch, is that end users don't care. If it costs you, okay, if it costs you 5 years to make the fix, then okay, end users won't like that. But if it costs you $1 million versus $5 million, okay, the accountant guys internally will care, but the end users may not care. So we're very, very careful about telling people to factor in how much it is to make the fix. But it's important to understand how hard it is to fix, but don't necessarily factor into the overall risk. So let's go through a real simple example. This is a level 1 data flow diagram from a payroll application. And I want to look at just one little area, which is a user interacting with a process called service client request.
Just to be clear on something, sorry. So these are real piece of code, or is it an example that is made up for the purpose?
No. So this was actually derived from work with our internal, they're called OTG these days. What does OTG stand for?
Operations and technology.
Okay. So our IT people internally, is they have these DFDs.
Facilities.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, they have these DFDs. So this is actually a butchered version of one of those DFDs. So there's a user interacting with this process, and that process is very logical. I mean, the physical manifestation of that, we don't really care too much about at this stage. That could be a web service, could be a web server, could be a web page, could be an Oracle database with some stored procedures. We don't really mind that much. There's just some process, a logical process, that is actually processing a payroll request. So we drill down a little bit further. You'll notice that one of the things that Frank talked about, or at least alluded to, was trust boundaries. In other words, there is a boundary within the application where the data is verified as being trusted for some reason. There are these trust boundaries where data goes from one realm to another realm. So you make a request against the web server, it goes from sort of the internet realm, where all the cowboys live, into your data center, where you hope there are no cowboys, and you hope it's a fairly controlled environment. So how do you validate the data is actually correct on the way in, well-formed? And where are the trust boundaries? It's important to understand where those boundaries are, because you may actually say that, as long as there's no other external data source that's coming into within this trust boundary, we may not need to verify it again, because it's within the trusted boundary. So as a user making a request, so the payroll request is a data flow going from the user back to the actual process itself, and then there's a response going back. The important thing to note, and Frank once again talked about this, were the privilege levels. The word privilege there is probably not really the right word, but what sort of level of, I'm going to use the word privilege. What level of privilege is required to initiate this data flow? Because the attackers will generally follow the line of least resistance. If you have a very simple app that has two data flows, one can be initiated anonymously, and one requires that the user be an admin, the bad guys will always follow the anonymous data flow because there'll be no resistance put up to their request by the application because it's always anonymous.
Unless they happen to be an admin.
I'm sorry?
Unless the bad guy is the admin.
Unless the bad guy is the admin, absolutely. So to initiate this data flow requires a user. This is not anonymous, which means we must be authenticating the user to actually validate that it really is a valid user. Now, there's a request being made and there's a response coming back. I'm going to focus just on one data flow, which is the one coming back from the client request service or process. And that is the payroll information coming back. Now, that payroll information is potentially sensitive because it contains payroll information, salary information, medical information, potentially social security numbers, and other private information as well, which is an information disclosure threat. If someone can view that, then they can view potentially sensitive data. Well, it turns out, and this seems pretty obvious, but all privacy issues are a subset of information disclosure threats. In other words, the ability to be able to view something. The fact that you can view some data that could be personally identifiable or sensitive could lead to privacy issues. So one thing that we're looking at right now is how can we start factoring in these privacy issues. And it's very early work right now. Some work being done by J.C. Kennan on taking a DFD and being able to adorn data flows and data sources with certain privacy semantics so we can actually derive potential privacy issues moving forward. I'm only going to focus in on just one potential threat, and that is this one, which is the information disclosure threat, which is someone can view this payroll information as it comes back from the service client request process. So looking at the threat tree, so there is the threat, which is the ultimate goal that the bad guy wants to achieve, which is viewing the payroll data because it is sensitive. And it's an information disclosure threat. So what conditions must exist for that threat to actually be real, to actually pull it off, to actually pull off an attack against us? Well, first of all, the traffic has to be unprotected, and the attacker must be able to view the traffic. Hence this "and" clause up here across the subnotes. If the traffic's unprotected, but there's no way the bad guy could ever view it, you don't have a threat. So the attacker must be able to view the data. Okay, I understand the traffic is unprotected, but I don't understand how an attacker can view the traffic. What conditions must exist? So you can say, okay, well, the bad guy could use a protocol analyzer or listen to traffic as it goes through a router. So, okay, protocol analyzer, I understand. What about the router? Well, for that to exist, the router is unpatched. This is actually a non-admin scenario. I'm not taking into consideration a rogue admin here, or a rogue person controlling that router. But the router is unpatched, and I've compromised the router, or I managed to guess the router password. As I mentioned before, there is also the scenario of someone who controls that router viewing the data as well. Fred?
Do you have to think of those things, or are there a set of patterns that you have?
Yeah, there are a set of patterns. Absolutely. Yeah. So Frank and I have been thinking about this over the last couple of weeks about how to identify some of those patterns, just to save time, if nothing else.
But no, it has to be more than to save time, because if you don't understand how one of those components works, then you're not likely to be able to invent the ways that it could be compromised.
Mm-hmm. So you mean coming up with a list of, so you mean for the person who may not be security savvy?
I mean, who knows, how many people know, sorry, it's possible that you don't know that routers get patches.
Right.
I mean, like it's a piece of hardware, you buy it from Cisco. Yeah. Who knew it had software in it, right?
Sure. Absolutely. Good point. There was another more compact way of representing it, which is this outline view. I've got to be honest with you, I actually like the tree diagram. Even though it doesn't really lend itself very well to short documents, I think it's just much more discoverable. But that's just a personal preference. So now we apply risk to that tree. And basically, if you look at the top node of the tree, which is the actual real meat of this discussion, that's where the damage is. If that thing becomes real, there is a damage that could ensue because you've got this issue in the system that may lead to, in this case, the payroll data being compromised or being viewed. And so there's a damage associated with that. The conditions or the stuff, the subnodes underneath that top node all have a certain chance of occurring. Or depending if you're using damage multiplied by chance or damage potential, or using dread. So in the case of using overall risk is what's the overall damage if this becomes real versus the chance of someone actually pulling this off. Damage is up here, and the chance of someone pulling it off all apply to the subnodes, not to the top node. That's the ultimate goal. These are the conditions that must exist, and there's always a chance of those occurring. So using combinatorics and just keep it nice and simple, risk is chance multiplied by damage. We're going to say that if someone pulls this off on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being we don't care really, 10 being the sky is falling, we're going to rank this a 9 primarily because it's a privacy issue. If someone can view someone else's payroll information. So we'll rank it as a 9. Then you look at the leaf nodes and say, okay, what are the chances of those leaf nodes occurring? So the traffic is unprotected. We'll just say, well, you know what, in our design right now, the traffic is unprotected. So the chance of it occurring, 1 being the chance of it occurring are exceptionally slim, 10 being it's already happening. Well, this is already happening. And then we apply some sort of chance of occurring to the other subnodes as well. So chance of occurring, someone could use a protocol analyzer. Well, the level of difficulty there is finding the icon on the desktop. And so on and so forth. And then just using some form of combinatoric calculation, we calculate the overall risk in the subnodes, going further up, until finally we multiply those two puppies together. We end up with an overall risk ranking of 83, which on a ranking of like 1 to 100, this is pretty nasty. We've got to resolve this some way. So it's just a very simple way of ranking threat. Now, something else we've also found is that as you get closer and closer and closer to shipping a product, the type of bugs that get fixed are the ones that just work, the day before shipping, you're going to fix a recall class bug. You're not going to fix a documentation bug, but you'll fix a recall class bug, absolutely. And so one thing we found is that we can actually set this sort of dread rating or whatever calculation you're using. An M5, we fix anything that's a dread rating of this and above. An M6, we fix anything at a dread rating of this and above. The day before we ship 100s. We fix 100s. In other words, we would have to recall the product. So I'm not going to say it's very scientific, but it's a nice way of trying to set the bar as to what gets fixed as you get closer and closer to shipping. Don't get me wrong, there is always the oh crap bug as well, which is just falls out of all calculation. But the oh crap bugs always exist. Yeah, Fred?
Do you ever do a sensitivity analysis to see just how sensitive the conclusion is to some of the estimates people use?
No. I haven't personally. There's a gentleman in the developer division by the name of Eric Jarvie who has been looking at this. Another guy in web services, John Lambert, who's also been looking at this as well. I have not been involved at all. So I can't speak to what's happening, but they've been doing some preliminary analysis. But I'll take it up with them, and if I get information from them, I'll forward it to you. I don't know what they've been doing. All right, so threat model's all well and good. So you end up with this document that explains a whole bunch of threats, and that's all nice. But a threat model on its own is really kind of useless unless you use it to do something. Well, we've actually found that you can use the threat model to actually build a relatively good design, or at least understand appropriate mitigation techniques as you're building the application. So remember we talked about this thing called stride, and we believed 3 years ago or so that Stride was threat modeling and we're just dead wrong. Well, there is still a use for Stride, a very useful, valid use for Stride. Now, it's not just identifying what the type of threats are, but also the mitigation techniques. And I say techniques as opposed to technologies. So, for example, you got a spoofing threat. You can use authentication. You have a tampering threat. You can use authorization, access control mechanisms, so on and so forth. So there is broad brush techniques that you can apply. Now, if you go back to our threat scenario, so the different threat types, spoofing, tampering, repudiation, blah, 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 elevation of privilege, there are some broad brush mitigation techniques, like authentication. Now, the technology that you choose depends on many, many things. You can't just say, well, to mitigate that threat, use SSL, because that may not be pertinent in the environment within which you're running. It may not even be applicable at all. You may have no expertise to deploy that scenario. You may not have the budget to deploy that scenario. And so from the threat types, spoofing, tampering, repudiation, blah, 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 there are these broad brush techniques like authentication, access control, blah, blah, blah. And from that, you can choose different technologies that are based on many things like cost, skill set, does it really fix the problem, does it fix the problem well enough, and so on. So, for example, you wouldn't use NTLM to solve to mitigate a server authentication spoofing problem, or sorry, a server spoofing problem, because NTLM doesn't authenticate the servers, it only authenticates the clients. You would definitely use Kerberos. Yeah.
I have one question. When you apply mitigation techniques, then you need to, let's say, add some components to your systems. Then do you have to do threat analysis again, or no?
So generally, no. The one thing we do look at is the cost of that mitigation technique. As a general rule, what we'd say to people is you choose the mitigation technique that you think really does mitigate the issue. And that's why part of the security audit process is us reviewing some of those critical threat models to make sure they really are mitigating the threat, to have that sort of security eye looking at them. No, generally people don't rework their threat models based on the mitigation. And there's a broad brush of authentication techniques. There's a broad brush of encryption techniques. There are broad brush authorization techniques and access control techniques that you can choose from based on the platforms you have, the skill sets, the cost, and so on. So to go back to our threat tree, just a little rule of thumb that we apply. If you really want to mitigate something properly, then what you do is you look for the high-level and clauses and see if you can mitigate something high up in the tree. If you can mitigate something high in the tree, you can probably mitigate it correctly. And so, for example, we have a threat tree here that has a very high and clause with one dangling node at one side and a subtree down one side. So it makes sense to say, well, can we mitigate the traffic is unprotected or remove that particular condition by mitigating the traffic is unprotected condition? Well, it turns out we can. We can use encryption because then the data is actually protected and can't be viewed as it goes across the wire. And there's a broad brush bunch of technologies that we can choose from. SSL, TLS, IPsec, web server security, DCOM or RPC using privacy and integrity, and so on, all depending on the environment within which you're running. Yeah, Virgil.
So the implication is that if you mitigate the left side, which is just a single box, you validated that end, and you don't have to do anything on the right side to mitigate the threat. That seems to be the logical implication of that.
Next build. No. That will be the simple thing, right? It's just like we fix that, and therefore the whole problem goes away.
Well, that problem at the top certainly goes
right.
away if you have an end.
Yeah. It does, until someone can factor SSL or factor RSA. I mean, then then you have all sorts of other. Well, that will be the least. That will be the start of our problems. But no. What we say to people is that doesn't mean you cannot think about the other side of the tree. Yeah, you fixed the problem. Yeah, you fixed it.
But I think you can ignore the other side of the tree if you have an end.
I mean,
it's done. The other part is not
right. So if it's a true end and if there are no other conditions.
But that's what that is, by definition.
No, you're absolutely correct. And now, one of the things that we task testers with doing is, can they come up with other nodes in that tree?
So you have to be careful with this.
Yeah.
I mean, they need
Now,
to be careful.
now, one thing that we do not want people to do is to mitigate things solely by looking at the second set of red boxes with a patching policy and a password policy. Now, here's why. Conventional wisdom dictates that to be secure, you need to stay on top of virus signatures, you need to have firewall, and you need to be up to date on patches. I have no disagreement with those three. But they don't really solve the problem on their own. And the reason is they require people to do things, and do things correctly, and to do them all the time. And so having a good patching policy, you should absolutely have a good patching policy in place for your routers. And you absolutely should have a good password policy for your routers and for your computers and so on, and for your users. But that doesn't solve the problem. It's a defense in depth mechanism. That's all. These are infrastructure mitigations that require people to do the right thing and to do things the right thing all the time. To fix the problem is to put a change in the code that says, I will not allow the communication between the user and the service to occur unless SSL is enabled. It will not occur. That way the threat can never exist. Now, as a developer, I have complete control over that. That is the way the product ships. I do not require the user make any changes. I do not require the user to stay on top of some configuration issues.
I think probably in the future iterations of the presentation, you want to define this, look for high-level end clauses. You don't necessarily look for high level, you look for the right level of end clauses.
Right, okay, good point.
And it may very well be that some of these lower level boxes are part of other trees, and you may end up looking a lot more at low levels than at high levels. So this leads you, at least it led me, in a totally wrong direction. So this may be just a matter of presentation and not a matter of methods. But this is part of the problems that I've had in the past. I'm not sure when there is a flow of presentation of the flow of method. So that's one of the things at some point we've got to find out.
So just one other thing. Actually, John, you had a question or a comment? Or?
No, I was just going to say if Virgil was right when the report that we might be missing the forest for the attack trees.
Great.
So I want to return to the earlier comment that you only have to eliminate one branch of an AND clause. If you believe in the doctrine of defense in depth, then defense in depth is equivalent to eliminating multiple clauses of an AND in this picture. And that's really
And that's why the very last bullets down the left boxes at the bottom have defense in depth. This is just one example, right?
But really the issue, so yes, putting it at the bottom is what you do, but it's because you want to have more AND clauses violated at the top.
Right. Correct. I agree 100%. I should probably just beef up this and just make it much more complete. But I wanted the presentation to last like an hour as opposed to all day.
Real quick, speaking of that program note, we are now cutting into our break again because we took a little bit longer for the lunch discussion. So it's about.
I can make it last 15 minutes more, if that's okay.
Is that what you got?
We should not take a break now. You have a lot of inertia. And
just want to make sure if you
does
got
anybody want to assassinate?
mob rule there.
Take a break at lunch.
Go.
All right. I'll keep going. So one thing we do watch out for very heavily in threat models is when someone says, well, we mitigate this threat because the user did something. In other words, nothing that's in the application. It's something the user has to do. A good example of this were some threat models for UPnP that said, well, these threats are mitigated if you have a firewall. So what happens if the firewall's not there? Then the threats really exist. Well, and it turns out like 1 or 2 of the threats were actually pretty serious, and they went back and made some changes to the way they actually installed the system. And that way the threat was actually mitigated because they did the right thing, as opposed to expecting someone they have no control over doing the right thing and doing the right thing all the time. In terms of code, so threat models help you with the design aspect, which we found probably the most useful. You can actually code to a threat model as well, but generally developers get the least benefit from threat models. One thing we have found is that with security pushes, you must always do the threat modeling beforehand. This was a mistake we made in the Windows security push. We did code reviews, test plan updates, documentation scrubs, and threat modeling in parallel. The SQL Server team looked at what we did and said, we'll do the threat modeling first. And that's the way it's going to be, that's the way security pushes are done now. And the reason for that is a threat model will say, oh my, this is an oh crap portion of the application that has a lot of risks, a lot of serious threats, higher risk threats. Therefore, or a lot of anonymous data flows coming into it, therefore we need to spend most of the time in terms of prioritization during the security push on those high-risk items first. And so we found that the threat models really help doing that. The last bullet point here about all input is evil until proven otherwise is that if you are using a DFD and you know where the data came from and you know the privilege level required to initiate that data flow, and if it's an anonymous data flow, then you better be very wary of that data because chances are that's where the attackers will be. And one thing that we do when we're looking at threat models and looking at the DFDs, and then we're doing code reviews based on those DFDs, is we look at the code that is along that anonymous path in the DFD. Which code is touched along the way? Because that's where the bad guys will go. The last one, testing to a threat model, we never expected this. We never envisaged this would happen at all. But during the Windows security push, a bunch of the testers in the Windows security team thought, well, how can we take a threat model and help us build better security tests? Now, the big problem with many testers is they're not security testers. A lot of testers, what they do is they take the spec and they want to prove that it works as per the spec. Yes, I clicked here, and yes, I got a public-private key pair. Okay, that's nice. Now, is there a way of getting a public-private key pair without authenticating yourself in the first place? Those kinds of things. People don't generally tend to think that way. Some would say it's a good thing. But you want to take these people who are just good testers, but they're very systematic, sort of functional testers. How can you at least help them build some kinds of black hat test plans when they're not really black hat testers? Now, don't get me wrong, you should have black hat testers in your team as well who are just downright evil. You should have those people in there as well. But those people are actually hard to come by. In general, in terms of the overall percentage of the population, they're relatively hard to come by. So how can we help those people out? Well, it turns out that for every threat in the threat model, you should have tests. So now, all of a sudden, you have an idea of what needs testing. So for every threat in the threat model, you need to have black hat and white hat tests. Black hat tests to prove that it doesn't work, and white hat tests to prove that it just works and works good enough. Well, for the next thing for testers is, okay, I know that needs testing, but how do I test it? I mean, these people don't necessarily have that expertise unless they are dedicated black hat testers. And so going back to the threat model, looking at the threat type, you have spoofing threats, tampering threats, so on and so forth. Remember I said before that there are mitigation techniques. So for spoofing, you can use authentication and good credential storage, tampering, authorization, message authentication codes, digital signatures, and so on. Well, it turns out that for those mitigation techniques, there are sort of broad black hat testing techniques as well. Now, I don't for one moment pretend to say that these techniques are complete. And I'm very open to any input whatsoever on how to make these more systematic and more complete. So, for example, authentication. Can you brute force creds? Can you do credential replay? Can you just take this packet that looks kind of interesting and just replay it? And does it work? Can you downgrade to a less secure authentication scheme? I don't support version 2. I only support version 1. Backward compatibility. Get you every day of the week. You have to have backward compatibility. And it's one of the weaknesses. Is this backward compat from a security standpoint is a weakness. we have the LM hash in Windows purely for backward compatibility. But NTLM is much better, and Kerberos is even better. But the LM authentication scheme is relatively weak, and in light of today's threats, we need to start phasing that out. And in fact, we have plans on the board to do that. But can you write a client that says, I don't do version 2, I only do version 1, and then start doing credential replay, man-in-the-middle attacks? Can you view the credentials on the wire, and so on? So,
before you go on, in what sense is viewing credentials on the wire an authentication problem? To what extent?
Well, if you can replay that.
But you already had credential replays before.
No, good point. Good point. It's one and the same thing. There's many others as well. I'm not going to, repudiation, information disclosure. One thing that we ask testers with all information disclosure threats is take special care and special analysis of any information disclosure threat to see if there's any privacy issue there. Is there any PII in there? Is there anything sensitive? Is there anything confidential? Keep an extra eye on that data. Denial of service, elevation privilege.
By the way, viewing credentials on the wire may be a privacy issue. Because by viewing credentials, you can tell where the client comes from and what are the relationship with all sorts of certification authorities and so on. It's more of that than authentication.
I'd be really annoyed if someone got my creds and just started logging into my bank account and moving money around. But that becomes a privacy issue as well at that point. But fair point. Yeah.
We could probably generate a lot of other things that could be looked at. I'm just wondering how you bound this. For instance, traffic analysis can be a privacy threat without actually looking at the information. There's the meta information that traffic is actually going.
Sure, yeah.
So where do you bound these kinds of things?
I remember when Joel Scambray was working at Foundstone, and he and I were having a conversation. It was a pretty sensitive conversation in email using S-MINE. One of the emails I sent to Joel was, I wonder how many radars we've just made a blip on just because we're using S-MINE. You can't read the email necessarily, but I wonder how many people are interested in this conversation just because we're using S-MINE. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't even think I have a good answer to that right now.
Sorry. One thing you said just a moment ago was if we have any ideas about adding to this list. Well, I don't right now, but I'm sure we could all go away and think about it. How useful would that be, and at what point would you like people to give you input?
Exceptionally useful, because then we could get people start. One thing we are doing right now is building libraries that can help build test tools around these types of attacks or types of black hat testing. And we know it's not complete because we don't have all these attack techniques. So they're very, very useful, because then we can start building more and more of these libraries and also come up with ideas for how to really implement that kind of attack. And if you ever get anything, just please feel free to email me.
Give us the list.
Right. I can give you the list and what we have now.
Yeah.
And my email address is in here as well, so please feel free to email me at all. I know this man's got some ideas as well.
Break in and leave them suggestions.
Never be better than yours, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's right, James. Testing threat mitigation. So now I've got these ideas in mind about how to test this stuff. So from a white hat perspective, you can say, okay, functionally, is that traffic protected accordingly, appropriately? So, for example, someone decided to encrypt the data by rolling their own encryption mechanism and exclusive ORing the data as it goes across the wire with a hard-coded key at either end. That just isn't good enough. So, no, functionally it's not good enough. Now, from a black hat perspective, can you force traffic to be unprotected? I've seen actually a bunch of sites where they require SSL, but only if you link from their site to the SSL site. So the URL is https:// blah, blah, blah. But if I just type in the URL in my browser, http:// really sensitive stuff.com, whack login, blah, 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 it lets me in without using SSL. So, even though SSL is there, it's not enforced. It's an option as opposed to being enforced. Is the crypto weak, as I mentioned before? as we all know, I mean, encryption of this data is actually, encryption is easy. The hard part is the key management. How are the keys exchanged? Hopefully doing something where it just happens under the hood, so you don't have to worry about that sort of stuff. But how the keys exchange, how are they stored? Are the defense in depth mechanisms okay? Are there any more? But most importantly, a good tester may be able to find more conditions to add to this tree. And that tester should get a good review next time round for finding more conditions in the tree that people never thought about. And frankly, as new threats exist, and new threats are found on the internet, you need to go back to these threat models to review them to see. We need to update these because there are different conditions that can exist now that people now understand about. Some threat modeling notes, some of the critical ones here. First of all, they should be scenario-driven. Frank sort of alluded to that, but I'll give you a very concrete example. As I mentioned before about IE, when we went back to the IE guys during the security audit for Windows Server 2003, we were interested in just one scenario. We didn't care about anything else, just one scenario. Now, as an admin browsing the internet from a domain controller, what's the potential for damage? And that's why we made the changes to IE. By thinking about just that one scenario, because the potential for damage is absolutely catastrophic. I mean, the admin can do anything on the box. We don't know what's on the internet. I mean, there's all sorts of icky stuff on the internet. And finally, it's on a DC. You could compromise one DC. You could potentially start taking down other DCs as well. You need to determine the privilege that's required to initiate those data flows, simply because that helps you determine the chance of attack. And also, if you have an unauthenticated data flow deep in the bowels of the app and is still unauthenticated, it's never been challenged or authenticated, then that's where the bad guys are going to go. I already mentioned about information disclosure threats being potential privacy issues. Yeah?
For scenario-driven, how much do you look at cross-cultural issues? So, in country X, they require deposit of the crypto keys. Country Y, the definition of what's private is different.
Right.
How much of that is done?
So that's creeping into things now. In fact, there are a number of threat models, actually, especially for the crypto guys in Windows. A lot of the threats reflect the issues within France, and well, they did with in the case of France, and so on. But yeah, they actually do reflect the implications of. Some threat models reflect the implications of privacy laws, crypto export laws, import laws, and so on. Would I say everyone's doing it? Absolutely not, no. But more people who are sensitive to it kind of seem to understand that they need to do that. I think we need to make that more, probably need to call that out more as well. John, please.
I think specifically on the privacy issue, when Jeffrey Friedberg talks about the Windows privacy standard, you'll see that this really was crafted in accordance with international views of privacy, not just the U.S.-centric views.
Is there, sorry.
No, go on.
So, I mean, a flow-based tracking by hand, you can imagine tools that help you statically track flows through the code, dynamically, say in the CLR, you could tag objects with source information, messages, so forth. Is there any thought given to longer-term support for this sort of thing?
I'll jump over to John.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's shorter-term things that we're doing, and at the Summer Security Conference, I was talking to Andrew Myers, one of your colleagues. A lot of this relates to both information flow and even before we get to the general information flow problems when we're dealing with control flow sensitivities, even just viewing some of these things as pure data flow has value. So yeah, definitely looking at the tools interaction with threat modeling in, again, like I said, both to generate the information, to check the information, and to make use of the information are all three important routes to attack on.
With that, I'm basically done on the threat modeling side of the house. I just wanted to point out some of the little differences that we have between Frank and I. They're not serious differences. We hope to bring sort of this unified theory moving forward, but we're just not there yet. But one thing I want to point out is that the really sort of warming aspect of this is that threat modeling has become a household term within the company. Everyone's doing it. Now, don't get me wrong, some people are doing it much better than others, but in general, people are doing it. And the nice thing about that is that the efforts are shifting away not just from just doing code reviews and building good test plans, but understanding the design implications of the decisions that they make based on the threats. And I think that's great to see, because it means that this is helping drive things like attack surface reduction and design changes, and disabling old technology. Because in light of today's threats, some old technologies just don't make the grade anymore. It's just a simple fact of life. So I'm basically done. I don't want to hold you up from... I realize I'm between you and food. Well, between Dave and food, anyway.
Excellent, my boy. No, essentially what we're going to wind up doing now is to shift focus a little bit. The next session is to start talking about the larger aspects of threat modeling and where it could be taken. I think it would behoove us to bring John up to speak a little bit, to talk a little bit more